Thank you very much for joining us today. It's mid-March already, and it's crazy to think of the speed of time. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us for the latest installment of the Rubach Wealth Living Room project. For those of you who are not familiar with this concept, it started with a close friend, Michael Albert-Severich and Felix Drzewski in Germany during the first COVID lockdown in March of 2020. And the idea of this project is to create a virtual giving circle to inform friends, families, and guests about the situation of non-for-profits during COVID and awareness, and raise funds when possible for their works and the type of work they're doing on the grounds during these times, right? So, on this occasion, we decided not to ask for donations because we want to make sure that people are informed first of what's going on in the world. Intentionally, because of the current donation structure in Canada, and we know that largely and by a lot, donations are going to universities and hospitals. The Rubach Wealth Living Room Giving Project invites all non-for-profit entities except for universities and hospitals. So it's nothing personal. We just want to enable the platform and our social resources to other people who don't necessarily get that much attention. So this week, I'm beyond excited to welcome 3 leaders of notable charities doing great things around the world. One of them has left me in tears multiple times, and they will be sharing with us their thoughts on why global philanthropy matters now more than ever, how we can make a positive impact. And we're joined by, drum roll, Sam Nutt, president and founder of War Child Canada and War Child USA, Boris Martin, CEO of Engineers Without Borders Canada, and Rachel Pulfer, executive director of Journalists for Human Rights. So if you have any questions, this is a conversation. Let's make it live, let's make it fun. Crazy stuff is allowed, but it is important to stick to a commonsensical code of conduct. So I'm going to read a little statement that we came up with. The Rubach Wealth Living Room Giving webinars have been designed to facilitate open, thoughtful public conversation. Any form of harassment, abuse, or similar behaviors discourages the attendees, and it's really not fun. So those will not be tolerated, and if we see anyone rowdy, we will have to eject. So without further ado, I will open the conference. Please, questions, we have the chat box, send them, and eventually we're hoping to have time to unmute participants and allow you to ask your questions directly. So please enjoy, and I will pass it over. I'm going to mute myself for now.
Well, welcome, and thank you for having us. It's really a pleasure, Alka, and as a good friend, it was such a pleasure that you invited us and instigated this conversation. It's a remarkable initiative. We thought, Sam and Rachel and I have had a chance to talk to each other and to prepare a little bit of a presentation. We thought we would start with just a simple introduction so that you can get to know who we are. We didn't decide who was going to start.
Go ahead, Boris. Go ahead, Boris. You already got the microphone.
Sounds good. So my name is Boris. I'm the executive director for Engineers Without Borders Canada. And I have been for 6 years, but it's an organization that I've really interacted with and participated with for the past almost 15 years. I was brought up in a family to care about the welfare of people around the world. And I took engineering at university, and I've always had a belief that technology can drive extraordinary change in people's lives. And EWB has really allowed me to marry these two things in my life. I was graduating from university a bit skeptical about global development. So that was I graduated a Ph.D. in engineering in 2007. And EWB was kind of a way for me to see the world from a different lens and to test myself at taking action towards global development. So I spent 3 years in West Africa in a small landlocked country called Burkina Faso. And I took bucket showers and used the latrine and lived with a family, learned the local language for 3 years, and to understand the grassroots and how people, sort of get through their own lives in very low resource environments. I co-founded a startup in Burkina Faso. Then I saw the level of entrepreneurship that's available, and that's like asking to thrive in these contexts. And I came back to Toronto with a passion to unlock that potential. So that's kind of like my little story about myself and EWB.
I can go next. I'm Samantha Nutt. I'm the founder and president of Wartel Canada and Wartel USA. I'm actually a medical doctor and public health specialist by training, but I started working in international aid in complex humanitarian emergencies about 25 years ago. I'm 100 years old. And but I started with the United Nations in Somalia and then worked in various war zones after that. I'm also a staff physician at Women's College Hospital in Toronto and an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Toronto. And I think if I were to describe my work over the last 25 years, I also write and speak publicly about international affairs and foreign policy. It's really been what I've learned out of my time in different war zones around the world is that if we really want to move the dial forward, if we want to meaningfully disrupt the cycle of violence and poverty and human rights abuses that so many war-affected populations face, we need to take a long-term view of the problem of war, and we need to begin to tackle some of the real structural deficits around education, around access to justice and women's rights that are so prevalent particularly in many war-torn and impoverished environments throughout the world. And that became the founding of Wartel Canada many years ago now, more than 20 years ago, and is our reason for existence, and is certainly the reason why I get out of bed every single day. I do believe that war is a problem that can be solved, it can be addressed, but it takes a different approach than what we have been seeing for many years now around sort of short-term interventions that save lives, but don't actually prevent violence and atrocity from occurring in the first instance. So that's why I'm here today, and that's why I do what I do, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you.
Thanks, Sam. I'll go next. My name is Rachel Pulfer, and I'm the Executive Director of Journalists for Human Rights, coming on 10 years of being JHR's ED, which is kind of extraordinary to me. My background is I grew up in Lesotho and Swaziland in Sub-Saharan Africa and also in Papua New Guinea. My father was an organic and computational chemist who worked with development projects all around the world. He was into the green revolution and biogas and clean energy at a time when, frankly, nobody else was. And so I had a kind of a kid's eye view of development work, which gave me a certain cynicism about development for a period of time, and an insight, I think, that I think all three leaders on this webinar share about how to do development right, as opposed to the top-down expat, expert-driven version that was going on in the early 80s when my father was doing that work with CEDA in Lesotho and Swaziland. We left Lesotho in '86 at the height of the state of emergency in South Africa. It was starting to get a little dangerous to live there in that environment at that time with small kids. And so we moved to Canada for a bit and then on to Papua New Guinea. And I did history and political science at McGill University in Montreal, and then subsequently wanted to become a journalist. I actually didn't want to study development at the time because of my experiences when I was a kid. When the opportunity to work with Journalists for Human Rights came calling, however, I realized that this was a unique opportunity to use journalism skills on the world stage and to center human rights at the heart of reporting in a way that I have seen with my work with Journalists for Human Rights has been a systemic game changer in environments as varied as conflict Syria, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, South Sudan, here at home in Canada, working with Indigenous communities, a project that was my first project that I initiated when I became Executive Director of Journalists for Human Rights. It seemed crazy to me that we were doing this crusading human rights work overseas and not addressing systemic human rights issues here at home. So I launched the Indigenous Reporters Program, which is now 7 years strong and has trained over 1,600 journalists across the country on covering Indigenous stories and communities. Plenty more to say on all of those themes, but I think without further ado, let's move into the conversation we're all here for today, which is looking at the opportunity and the responsibility to step up as Canadians and support people all around the world who are all in this same storm of coronavirus, but we are not at all in the same boat. And many people have heard that phrase. I'm going to try and flesh out with one story what it actually means on the ground in Nairobi in Kenya, and then Sam's going to put us in a bigger, broader macro picture of what that means. When I think of what it means to and why it matters to support people internationally through COVID-19, I think of a young girl aged 11 at the time, when our gender media trainer in Nairobi, Judy Kaberia, met this girl. She was at 11 years old, 9 months pregnant. And this is something that had happened to her as a result of being in lockdown. A man who she called uncle had accosted her whilst everybody was stuck at home. So that was what it meant to be in pandemic lockdown in Nairobi. That girl is one of 10,000 teen pregnancies that have been reported in one state in Kenya as a result of the lockdown last year. There are 47 districts in Kenya. So we can only imagine just how prevalent this problem of teen pregnancy is. 98% of girls who get pregnant in Nairobi in Kenya do not return to school. As a result of the work that Judy and the JHR team in Kenya did, they were able to direct media attention to this problem in a way that has now engaged both the Kenyan government and the international community, who are engaging and providing support, in particular specialized supports for girls to be able to go back to school, and also safe housing in a scenario where it is often extremely dangerous for these girls to be in the same locations as potential predators. But that is what being in lockdown meant for far too many girls in Kenya. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Rachel. And I think particularly as Canadians, we've all experienced the hardship that's been brought about by lockdown, but also recognizing the challenges that dealing with this pandemic has meant to our daily lives and our ability to stay safe and to keep our loved ones safe. And I know many of us will remember, particularly early on in the pandemic, the feeling of being left behind when we couldn't get access to critical PPE, for example, because of hoarding that was taking place throughout the world and inflationary costs around that. And even now, as we thankfully still, we're starting to see the vaccine rollout, but for many weeks, we all watched as other parts of the world were able to vaccinate their most vulnerable citizens, and we were waiting and wondering when that would start to happen for us here at home as well. And these kinds of concerns and fears and realities are very much amplified in the environments in which all three of our organizations are working. It's true that particularly in many unstable, war-torn environments where there's very little civil infrastructure and government support, government infrastructure, that even accessing things like masks, having water to be able to wash your hands, if you even have sanitation supplies available to you, being able to move around to keep your family safe in that context comes with its own set of challenges. For example, just consider right now that we are facing throughout the world the worst refugee and displacement crisis since World War II, with many tens of millions of people who've been displaced from their homes. And these are extremely challenging environments in which to live, but also in which to ensure that you and your family can be protected against the threat of COVID. Often it's one, it's one tent that you're in, or one shelter, a huge amount of overcrowding, very poor ventilation in places. When you think about, for example, Syrian refugee camps where it's still cold outside and everybody's locked in together. So you can imagine when COVID occurs in these environments, when it gets a foothold, the opportunity for spread is quite tremendous. So these are some of the realities that we are dealing with. And at the same time, when you consider that based on the current rate of vaccination in what we often refer to as low-income countries, but countries that don't have the same level of wealth and access that we have here at home, we're currently anticipating that we won't even achieve 50% vaccination rate in those countries until well into 2023, if not 2024. So this is a challenge that is going to be with us in many of these environments for a very long time, at least for a couple of years. And as a result, it requires, I think, all of us to take a long, hard look at what it is that can be done to ensure that the world's most vulnerable citizens are protected, that they're treated fairly, that they have safety, that they have equitable access to the very tools that they need to be able to keep themselves and their loved ones safe moving forward.
Yeah, we often hear, and specifically in the beginning of the pandemic, we heard a lot of comments that, oh, we're all in this together. The virus sees no borders. And, we really wanted to translate that into being in the same storm. Like when Sam, Rachel, and I talked about the stories of how people have faced the pandemic in the past year, stories from our partners all over the world, it became very clear that the experience has been very different for different people around the world. And early into the pandemic, the economists started making projections about the economic disruption, and frankly, a lot of low resource economies made loadable, like, early decisions to lock down their countries and to protect their citizens. I think Kenya went into lockdown with only 12 or 13 cases in Nairobi, when the UK waited for 100 times that, like 1,300, I think, before locking down. So like very strong preventative measures, while at the same time people experienced the loss of income and the loss of opportunities in a dire way. The world before the pandemic was on track to achieve some remarkable progress when it comes to reducing the incidence of extreme poverty around the world. And we were building on, frankly, a historical commitment by 193 nations around the world to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal, a 2030 agenda that was, injecting a lot of momentum, a lot of effort behind very clear 17 goals with clear targets behind each of them. The pandemic has definitely disrupted that progress. We midway last year, one of our partners, VMO, surveyed households across Africa, and like specifically in Rwanda, to give you a sense, like 40% of households, almost 40%, reported that their income had decreased a lot, and another 20% responded that their income had decreased a little. So that's like 60. That's 60% of people, 6 out of 10. Like you look at the number of people on this call who would have had their income adversely affected. But the food security situation was also even more alarming. 27% of the population surveyed had reduced portion size, and 22% had to skip meals more than once in the past week when the survey was done. So that's kind of the way people have experienced, and we thought it was really important to acknowledge that, and to realize that not everyone is experiencing the pandemic in the same way. And then you look at home, right? Like there's gender lines and racial lines as well that have been drawn in pretty stark contrast in our own countries. Like women have been worse off in terms of job loss in all economies, are oftentimes frontline workers, more exposed to the virus. And the same for Black people across Canada, the United States. Like we've seen those stories, they're all over the media. So we wanted to highlight, acknowledge that this pandemic is affecting different people differently around the world.
Ain't no CERB in Rwanda, that's for sure. And that's part we're trying to direct attention to here. Thanks, Boris.
Along the same lines, and I'm going to be really brief here because I'm cognizant of the fact that we're only on slide 5 and we're already 25 minutes in here. I do want to point everybody's attention to the fact that on average each year, less than 7% of donations go to support international humanitarian causes. We will be talking about, there's this kind of perception that international charities are somehow, because money is going to other parts of the world, that they are less transparent and less effective. And one of the things we do want to do today is to dispel that myth. We are very transparent organizations. We can have a tremendous impact. We do a lot with a little. And we're also going to be talking about the fact that for our 3 organizations, we have very, very strong local engagement and local ownership of our programs. In fact, Warchild, for example, more than 99% of our more than 400 staff throughout the world are local, coming from those communities who are designing the programs, who are implementing and actually doing the work. So you can really maximize your contribution by giving to an international charitable organization. And there are ways, and we're going to talk about these, to make that donation even more effective in terms of how you give.
Yeah, and we're at the end of the day, there's the effectiveness of the partnerships we have, the fact that money, like my own personal experience in Burkina Faso, I was astounded with how far you can go with a little resources, and you'll see some of the stories we tell later on that exemplify that. So to me, there's like a rational side in philanthropy. If all lives have equal value, where can your money go further? That's personally what keeps me in the work that I do on international development.
And just to sort of give you a sense of the landscape right now for Canadian international development organizations and for charities more generally, and I'm sure some of you have read reports on this, but more than half of charities have seen a demand for their services rise during COVID. And yet 70% of organizations have at the same time seen a decline in our overall revenues, which means effectively that charities are working a lot harder with a lot less than they would have under normal circumstances, especially for organizations that derive revenues from, for example, events, being able to host events and fundraise through events and general kind of public appeals that are out there in the community. None of those activities, understandably, have been taking place. The average decline for most charitable organizations in 2020 was about 30% of their annual revenues. So again, I think it speaks to, as these gaps throughout the world, but especially for the most vulnerable, continue to grow and inequalities continue to deepen, the opportunities that we have because of a lack of resources to be able to meaningfully address those gaps, to tackle this crisis, diminishes, frankly, because of the lack of public engagement and public support for these issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's quite a perfect storm out there. And one of the things, though, that has been a really interesting aspect for me anyhow, and it came up in our discussions prior to this presentation, is this idea around really rethinking development. And Boris had mentioned that he had a skepticism for development. As a kid, I remember the insanity of seeing these projects that have been dreamed up in Geneva and New York being implemented in places like Lesotho, and all the chaos and mistakes, frankly, that were made in that process. And one of the things I loved about JHR when I came on board, and this was back in 2010, is that there was a stated commitment throughout the organization to work with local leadership, work through local leadership systems, and with local talent. And Sam has alluded to that as a commitment with Warchild as well. 99% of their staff are local. Boris, I know EWB practices the same types of principles. And for me, it was so exciting to be able to see what was actually possible in a scenario where you upended this weird post-colonial approach to development where there had to be white faces in the senior roles. And instead, the Ghana program was run by Ato Komena-Dadzi, who was a celebrated radio journalist in Ghana. Our Sierra Leone program was run by Sierra Leonean journalists, our Liberian program, DRC, South Sudan, and on it goes. And that has been an ongoing commitment that I find has been extremely empowering in terms of the work that we have done.
So the picture that we're trying to portray here today, and the evidence we're trying to provide you with, is the fact that even though we are in the scheme of international development organizations, we've all been around, all three of our agencies, for about 20 years, a little bit more, a little bit less, give or take a couple of years. And we are what you would consider to be small to medium-sized organizations in this country, but we all evolved in the late 1990s, early 2000s, in response to, I think, and this is a common theme for all three of our agencies, what we were seeing that was taking place throughout the world that we could probably best define as missed opportunities and really missing the mark. And I think it's no coincidence that many of our organizations evolved out of the shadow of September 11th and this sort of shift in global thinking and the instability that generated in the Iraq War, for example, the definite clampdown on different types of freedoms, journalistic freedoms in other parts of the world, and in particular, looking at the impact of war more globally in terms of War Child Canada and with Engineers Without Borders as well, looking at poverty and inequality. And so I think that, you know, even though we haven't been around for 100 years, the shared philosophy that we have as three organizations is that the most important kind of work that you can do puts local communities at the center of that process in those decision-making roles, that they are the ones who are guiding what can and should happen to build better, stronger, more resilient communities, in whether it's in the face of war or poverty or human rights abuses or a lack of journalistic and personal freedoms. So that's kind of the common thread that we all share. And I think, you know, and that's not to criticize other organizations at all, but it is to point out that we can do aid differently here. It is possible to decolonize aid by ensuring that you're not just engaging with local communities, but they are the ones who are driving that change. And that's something that all three of our organizations are deeply, deeply committed to. And maybe, Boris, you want to talk about EWB's thinking, and then Rachel just talk about what it means to be a journalist in this kind of environment too.
Yeah, I mean, like that we haven't covered yet, you know, like for me, what attracted me to EWB in the early days was this desire to rethink the way we were partnering, starting with people, starting with relationships, listening first. That actually coalesced after 8 years of work for EWB into like us deciding on our own accord to start publishing a failure report, because we felt like the international development sector was talking only about happy stories. Every project was a success. And yet at the same time, the reality in the field was quite different. So we said, let's role model and start publishing about our failures and what we're learning from them. And so this, you know, I really believe that smaller organizations that have kind of stayed true to the scrutinizing the effectiveness of our work, but also being part of the journey of self-improvement, right? Like, let's not pretend either that we're perfect organizations that have all ticked off the right boxes. This is a journey. And I think you know, right now in this moment, the Black Lives Matter movement is reminding us that we are part of a system that has lived racism, frankly, locally and globally for decades. And so, you know, I think this is still a journey we're on, but I'm glad to be part of an organization that for a long time has been part of that journey and continues to work on itself at the same time as delivering effective work.
Just jumping onto that last point. I mean, one of the things that is a little unusual for me is being on a panel with two other white faces. And I'm just going to put that on the table right now that we should talk about that at some point. But before we do that, I want to put someone else on the table for their work, which is Tamam Hazem, who is our team leader in our Syrian program, and just share an example of what I mean by system-wide change facilitated through local leadership and local talent. Tamam coordinated 2 years ago with the Aleppo Bar Association and the Syrian Islamic Council to put on the national agenda the issue of honor killing. There had been a particularly egregious example of honor killing that I won't describe the details of, but it was sufficiently shocking that people were talking about it. And so we worked with our network of journalists across northeastern Syria and northwest Syria to ask the question, who in Syrian society is responsible when a man kills a member of his own family in the name of honor? At the end of the series, the Syrian Islamic Council issued a fatwa calling out honor killing as un-Islamic. And the Assad government criminalized the practice last year. Mm-hmm. That's local talent and system-wide impact. That story itself cost about $1,000 Canadian in total, to keep an entire generation of women safer from the scourge of honor killing.
Thanks, Rachel. And you know, as we prepared for the conversation, it was striking how, you know, the three of us were talking about to each other about how remarkable the adaptation had been, you know, and the ability to continue doing work when you have deep partnerships on the ground. Stories.
The only thing I was going to add here, and then we can sort of move on, is and get into the stories, is just that because we have such strong local networks and such deep, deep connections with local communities, one of the important things for all three of our organizations is that despite the pandemic, we've been able to maintain our operations, where a lot of organizations that were heavily reliant on a more expatriate infrastructure to deliver the work had to scale down or scale back or even pull out of their field activities. That left our three organizations in a situation where we had to actually ramp up and mobilize our local teams. And one example of this for us is that when the Tigrayan crisis hit in Ethiopia and tens of thousands of people were fleeing across the border to Sudan, it was our Darfur team in Sudan that ended up relocating to the border areas to be able to respond to that refugee crisis. So there's an example of how that those strong local networks and strong local leadership and ownership were able to respond in a very dynamic way as the COVID crisis was taking place, but also combined with some of these other factors that were occurring throughout the world.
Nice. The story of adaptation of organizations. I was saying that, 7 years ago, we supported an organization called VMO in really starting. They were just an idea on a page. And they wanted to make sure that people who can't read and write and, speak their own dialect and are not into mainstream, English or French as official language in their own countries could actually be part of the democratic process, could be receiving essential information. And 7 years ago, we didn't know, but we were actually building a solution that would actually play a huge role during the pandemic. And as of February last year, VMO was already thinking ahead about crafting essential information in a diversity, hundreds of languages for people to be able to access on demand and inform themselves about how to protect themselves. And over the course of the past year, they were able to reach 16 million people who accessed 50 million pieces of information about the pandemic. And this was done in it hugely cost effectively. EWB didn't have to put out a huge lift and raise huge amounts of money to actually be able to do that, because we were there. We started 7 years ago, sort of nurturing and growing this idea, being supportive as much as we could so that it was ready now. And for me, the take home story, and we have multitudes of partners that have acted in that way, grounded in impact and principle. And we're able to really be, frankly, lifesavers. The story of Nubida Technologies is another one. They've provided more than 2,300 small business owners with the cash they needed to get through the pandemic when they had lost all income. And that's a shared reality with a small business like a pizzeria in Toronto has lost a lot of income in the beginning of the pandemic as well. But then they got wage subsidy programs. In Uganda, there was no wage subsidy program. So the impacts of that income loss was huge. And so we've seen all of our partners kind of like take on a new mission, almost overnight, and respond to the pandemic's impact in a remarkable way. And we're there as a support.
I think I'm up now, and we promised to wrap up here by 12:15 to give you time to ask your questions. But I mentioned this earlier, War Child believes in the integration of its programs in order to produce transformational change in the lives of children that are affected by war. And we do that in 3 ways. And I mentioned the access to justice, the education, as well as what we call economic development livelihoods piece of it, which allows families to become financially self-reliant. But today I want to focus on one piece of what we do, which is around education, and give you a very concrete example of how our work evolved and grew during COVID to be able to respond to the overwhelming need. Because a few years ago, we launched a program in education. One of the things we're known for throughout the world is that because kids are displaced as a result of war, they might end up caught in various armed factions, they might miss out on years of their education. And then that becomes a permanent barrier for them because they don't want to go back to school as 16-year-olds to finish, because the last time they were in school was grade 1. And that can sanction them really to a lifetime of frankly, poverty and generational deficits. So we run catch-up learning programs so that kids can do 2 years over 1 year and then reintegrate back into the appropriate grade level and complete their studies. And we know that it has an extraordinary impact on the lives of those children and also on their families. But in particular, in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which is certainly one of the world's worst wars. It's considered the worst war in terms of the numbers of civilians killed since World War II. More than 5 million people have tragically lost their lives as a result of conflict and the effects of conflict in that part of the world. And one of the horrific aspects of this particular conflict has been sexual violence perpetrated primarily against women and girls, to the point where families were keeping their girl children home or forcing them into early, for example, child marriage or unsafe labor practices because they were so afraid that their girls might be assaulted on the way to school. And again, creating huge barriers for those young women in terms of education and the fulfillment of their rights. And so a few years ago, we pioneered the first of its type in the world, actually, this distance-based education program using the basic technology of radio, which is widely available and accessible in that part of Eastern Congo, unlike, for example, other forms of technology like iPads and computers and that sort of thing. And we found after 18 months of this particular program in all of the areas in which we were working, we had more than 95% of the girls who are participating, boys were participating as well, because it was a community-based, but where the focus was really on the girls. They had a higher matriculation rate, higher graduation rate than actually the national average. So we could demonstrate that it was very effective. Well, then COVID comes along. And of course, because of the lockdown, there are so many more children, many tens of thousands of children in that part of Eastern Congo, but many tens of millions of children in other environments throughout the world that were being left out of education because they couldn't access online or other forms of learning. And so we were approached both by the government of Congo and also the government of Canada to see if we could scale up that activity, which we have done. And so it's our hope and expectation that this year that distance-based radio education will reach more than 1 million Congolese children who would otherwise not have been able to access that education. And that's an example of a program that we're also replicating in other environments, including in Uganda and Afghanistan and elsewhere. So and again, once you create this kind of initiative, the work goes into the creation of it, but the maintenance of it, the dissemination of it is actually quite inexpensive. And you can really, I think, reach an enormous number of kids using fairly inexpensive, widely available technologies like this to ensure that they have the best chance at a brighter future.
That's a great story, Sam. The power of radio, it's a game changer. It's fantastic. Journalists for Human Rights has been working with and through media as a way to change national narratives on and direct attention to human rights issues all over the world. And one of the stories, one of the aspects of COVID that we we're fairly early on to was the infodemic that accompanied the pandemic. So of course we have the outbreak of this mysterious disease that nobody can see. A lot of people don't actually experience in terms of symptoms. A lot of people to this day do not actually believe that the disease is as deadly as it is. The outcome or the results of that situation have been deadly for far too many people. Journalists for Human Rights started doing training, debunking misinformation and disinformation about COVID-19. Actually, here in Canada, we had a short pilot program funded by Canadian Heritage. And as the project got going, we saw huge interest and uptake. And Global Affairs Canada approached us, asking us if we could scale the work that we were doing to 12 countries across Africa and the Middle East, in a scenario where often in those environments, people do not trust their governments or their public health ministers regarding the information that they're sharing about how to protect themselves, but they do trust their local community radio reporter, trusted voice that they've had in their living rooms and in their compounds for years. So we stepped up to develop a program mobilizing media to fight COVID-19. And this is one example of how that worked in Mali. We've been working in Mali since 2019. And last summer, in the height of the pandemic, one of our journalists did a JHR mentored and supported story that pointed out how the hearing impaired were being shut out of the coronavirus protection effort because they were not able to understand television or radio broadcasts and PSAs about the virus and how to protect the community. That story led to Malian state television requiring sign language interpreters for any story or PSA produced that was coronavirus related. This in turn ensured that approximately 1.5% of the population of 20.6 million, which is approximately 309,000 people, were actually able to inform themselves on how to protect themselves and their communities. The training and the grant to support that story cost approximately $500. So $500 delivered entirely through local networks was able to protect over 300,000 people last summer, help protect them. And that's the promise and the power of Journalists for Human Rights, mobilizing media to change lives.
I mean, I'm just in awe. I hear one story after the other, and I'm sure it's not 1% of everything you guys have lived through and have been part of. So it's really exhilarating. And part of the reason behind Rubach Wealth Living Room Giving is I think we're all privileged, and we have the privilege of the color, and with privilege comes power, and that with, as Spider-Man once said, with power comes responsibility. So what I see you guys doing is you're going to the grounds and you are co-creating the solutions with the locals. You're not going there to tell them, no, this is not how you do it. This is how you do it. And you're knitting yourself into the tissue and finding really social mobility and opportunities for people. So that I think that you're giving people hope. They're not stuck and they don't have to join the cartel or just give up on life and assume that girls will never go to school. And when we work with clients at Rubach Wealth, we generally find that the vast majority wants to be relevant to someone. And when we talk about philanthropy as part of where they can direct their wealth, we want to reassure everyone that you don't need to be the big name on the hospital wing. You don't have to be the Weston family, and you don't have to overcommit because there's a huge fear of overcommitment. What we help people do is help them clarify that they are interested in giving. When they need to dive deeper into the causes they may want to give, we have people to do that. But the how you can give is multiple and varied. You can give appreciated stocks. That's a fabulous tax play. You can leave money in your will for a cause, a fabulous idea too. What we look for is for the will, because when there's a will, there's a way. And yes, there are tax benefits, and if it's available, why not use it? But what we're trying to do is raise awareness that it's up to us to make this a better place. And when your kids give up because they weren't even given a chance, it doesn't end well. And I'm from Mexico, and I know what happens when it breaks up. You know, education is not for everyone. Nobody trusts the government. The difference in incomes between the ones who have and the ones who don't have is astronomical. And that's when you see the rise of all these cartels and people giving up hope. And even if they will join the police force, well, they know that they're going to have to be part of the organized crime, because otherwise they're going to kill their family. So they're kind of stuck, right? So it's really not the how much. It doesn't have to be $1 billion. It's clarifying that you want to do it, and then we can help you find the best way that works for you and your family for the future. So I want to thank you guys. Really, really an honor to have you in our living room, in our virtual living room. I want to open it to questions. There was one comment in the chat box. So who wants to take it, Rachel?
Oh, sure. Yes, absolutely. So the comment shared earlier was regarding concerns about vanity self-empowerment type development entities and the importance of local empowerment that's required in order to achieve systemic change. And that comment is bang on. Frankly, all three of us and the organizations that we lead walk that talk every single day. And I think it's really important and a great opportunity that I think we're grateful to ELCA for, to help to work with one another to articulate how the work that we do is different from other organizations that perhaps have had higher profile in Canada in the past, and why it's so important to do this radically localized, decentralized, grassroots-based, building from the ground up development work. For just one example, Journalists for Human Rights doesn't build or finance radio stations with grant money. We find strong partners. We work to build up strength where we see it. We send trainers to provide some assistance when it comes to managerial assistance and training. And that, by the way, is a problem that is endemic to journalism worldwide. Often a station manager is someone who is a really good field reporter who was kicked upstairs. They usually need support in order to build and grow their ability to sustain their business. And that has been part and parcel of the way that we have done our work, finding strength in situ and building on it and nurturing it and growing it and networking it with other resources within that society that can help that entity to thrive. And I think that dovetails quite nicely with the way that EWB work does its social entrepreneurship work. I don't know, Boris, if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the thought I was going to share is potentially around, you know, at the end of the day, there is something we're getting out of this. You know, I feel so inspired and satisfied with my work. And so there is a little bit of selfishness in all this. You know, let's also not forget ourselves in the process. But to me, it's, you know, at the end of the day, so as a donor, I make donations. You know, I donate to a range of organizations and I feel good about it, and that's okay. And I have fun doing it as well. And what I get in return is rewarding. So like, I want to acknowledge that. And I think donors have a responsibility, frankly, to engage in serious dialogue. It's like the immediate feel good is important. And let's go one step further, you know, start asking questions like, where are these challenges coming from? And what I love about GHR and what I love about War Child is that systemic perspective on things. And EWB is trying to hold itself accountable to that too. And looking internally and looking at the work that we do in asking why multiple times, you know. Why isn't, I remember our work in Malawi in the early days and access to water and sanitation. It's like, yeah, you can build a water, you know, pump for one village once, and then after 18 months, it will be broken and won't be repaired. So like, why? What's going on? Who's providing, who's the infrastructure for everyone to get access to safe water forever and everywhere, you know? And it's like, that's a slightly different way to frame the problem. But it's a journey, right? And so like we count our best donors are the ones that just want to make EWB stronger. and are they thirsty to learn and to like discover the roles that they can play in their everyday life as well as change agents.
I'm gonna add to that too, and I think that both Rachel and Boris share this perspective that if our organizations are still around in 50 years, we will have failed. In the sense that we are not aspiring to be institutions here. We are aspiring to help those who very immediately and directly understand what their communities need to be able to defend their rights, protect the most vulnerable, create a pathway out of poverty. And that's kind of what all of us really focus on every day. That they are in a position where they have the skills and the resources to be able to take that over and to ultimately do that themselves. And so I wish very much that every day, I wish our organization didn't exist. And the fact that it does exist is, I think, a reflection of our failure as a global society to take action to protect those who need to be protected, and to make sure that we are not deepening global inequalities, that we are not propping up corrupted regimes, that we are not shipping our arms throughout the world with reckless abandon and profiting off of those transactions every single day, whether it's in our mutual fund holdings or whether it's in the technology we exploit through our cell phones that's mined, the components of which are mined in the Eastern Congo and which have contributed to violence and instability plaguing that part of the world. So we come at this, and I understand the sort of sentiment that there does exist, this kind of vanity, self-empowerment, self-discovery, pseudo-altruistic groups that are out there, and that's not the real work, and that's not what the work should be ever about. And we shouldn't exist. The story isn't about us. The story is about the tremendous courage and determination and resilience of those that we work with every day, and everything that we do is an expression of solidarity and support for their vision and their courage, and it's nothing more than that. And I certainly do hope. Not only will I be 100 years old in 50 years, but I certainly do hope that we're not having these same kinds of conversations 50 years from now. In my experience of 25 years in the aid sector, being around for a very long time, older doesn't necessarily mean better. And when you can say that you've been in a community working for 30 years, my question would be, well, then what are you doing? Because after 30 years of being in that community, they should be in a place where they can have complete ownership of whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. Anyhow, those are my 2 cents and my rather extended rant on that topic. So I'm very sorry about that. I'm going to add here too, the reason why we chose to come together and do this presentation together today is that we believe very passionately in each other's organizations and what we're trying to accomplish. And to all of you that are interested in donating, I just want to emphasize what Elke has already said, which is that you can't go wrong with any 3 of our organizations. Hopefully it's all 3 of our organizations, but really everybody's doing, I think, very profound and important work, and it's just a question of figuring out, what matters to you. And I liken your philanthropic portfolio the same as I would your investment portfolio. You can diversify, right? It should reflect the full spectrum of your concerns and your values as human beings. And it doesn't have to be one at the expense of the other, which is the common misconception. We can walk and chew gum here at the same time. You can care about sick children here at home and mental health here at home and fighting cancer here at home, and also care about the rights and opportunities of people living in other parts of the world and the tremendous inequalities and struggles that they face every single day. And on that note, I would also add that if you want to maximize your impact, monthly donations is really the way to go, because so often we as organizations spend a lot of time and effort and energy chasing donations every single year. But when we have those regular sustainable contributions, then we can better plan, then we can better operationalize our programs and really focus the work where it's needed the most.
So if you're thinking about charitable giving, we want to ensure that your gift complements your overall wealth managed values. So it's beyond the net worth, it's beyond the growth and making an extra buck. We'll be sending survey today. We want to hear your feedback because we want to improve this. We want to grow this all the time, every day. And there is always constructive feedback, or I call it constructive destruction. We welcome that. Please follow us on social media, share these links, comment, and join us in our next event. Next event will be on April 14th, completely different topic. Buckle up. It's Habitat for Humanity combined with the Black North Initiative. So it's pretty powerful, very strong. Please don't miss it. Please share. And again, let's continue. Even if we're 5 or 500, it's better than none. So a little bit helps. And if you want to donate to journalists, to War Child, to engineers, we will be sending the links, but they have their websites, of course, and the survey will have their links too. Monthly $5 count, monthly $20, give your receipt. So please, let's grow this, and your feedback is much appreciated and welcome. So everybody have a lovely afternoon. I am tap dancing. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers.